Hello, everybody, and welcome to First Person, a podcast about candid conversations with immigrants and first generation individuals who've created something meaningful. Like you've known by now, the hypothesis behind this podcast is simple that your lived experiences, especially as an immigrant or someone from an immigrant family, have a direct impact on what you create and can actually make you a better entrepreneur, creative, or builder. And today's guest is a perfect example of that. Mari Iwahara is a designer, a strategist, and the founder of Sibling, a cross-cultural brand consultancy based in New York City. And Sibling helps Japanese brands enter and navigate the US market. And Mari was born and raised in New York City to Japanese parents. She studied at RISD and built a career across branding, startups, and tech, working at places like Landor, Red Antler, Google's Jigsaw team before starting her own agency. So as you'll see today, Mari's story is about bridging worlds and finding strength in nuance. So let's get into it. Mari, I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. I'd love to really start with your early experiences. As you share with me, you were born and raised in New York City, but you grew up in a Japanese household. So what was that like growing up in this scenario?
Yeah, and thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of what you're doing, so excited to be here. So like you mentioned, so I'm born and raised in New York City, but both of my parents are from Japan. But they came at very different times in their lives, which kind of explains the balance with which I grew up. So my dad actually came over when he was 6 years old, and his father, so my grandfather, had come over through a Fulbright scholarship to practice and study medicine in the US. And this is in the 50s. So there weren't very many Japanese people coming over to the US. I think on the West Coast, there's been a lot more of a Japanese American population, but on the East Coast, there weren't that many yet. So my grandfather was really one of the earlier people who came over.
Yeah.
And thankfully, there was an American doctor who sort of took him under his wing. So he kind of showed him the way of American life and setting up his own practice. And so my grandfather decided to move his whole family over.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad and his mother, my grandmother, came over, I think, by boat to move to New York
Long trip,
and
yeah.
settle in. Yeah, which is crazy to think now. So he basically came without speaking any English, had to really learn and adapt quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember him telling me about like some of his early first weeks at school. And they were also living in Upper Manhattan, which there hasn't been very much of a, I guess, Japanese or East Asian population. So a lot of his schoolmates actually had never seen an Asian person before. So thankfully he wasn't like bullied or like discriminated or anything, but I think there was a lot of curiosity. So he would talk about, kids bringing him little gifts and offerings like throughout class. And I still remember him talking about one specific boy who came over one day and he asked my dad, can I see your hands? So my dad like puts out his hands and like shows it to the boy. And the boy counts my dad's fingers and he's like, oh, you have 10 fingers. I have 10 fingers too.
Wow. Like
As in like, yeah, you're not an alien.
Right.
Yeah, which is like so bizarre because it's less than 70 years ago. Anyway, so that's sort of like the environment that my dad arrived in. So he's completely educated in the New York City public school system, private school system, boarding school, university. So I think he's sort of kept, his Japanese language up by speaking with his family. I think he went to Japanese summer camp, but the way he thinks and kind of knows how to go through life is very much Americanized. So that's my dad.
Yeah.
And then in comparison, my mom came in her mid to late 30s. So she was, I think she's very outgoing. Her personality is a lot more, American than Japanese, but she's always been interested in foreign cultures. So I think she actually majored in Portuguese in university.
Huh.
Yeah, I think it was
right in Japan.
In Japan. She's completely
Oh, wow.
educated in Japan.
Yeah.
But I think
Hmm.
back then there was a big Japanese Brazilian population in Brazil. So I think business
Hmm.
wise it made sense. But she ended up working for Bank of America once she started working. And so I think she's always wanted to come to the US. And her first time was actually doing like a countrywide tour on a Greyhound bus. It was like a US wide tour, and she went to all the different states.
That's
But
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, but she knew she wanted to come back to New York. So um, she quit her job, and I think she enrolled in a language program at NYU
Hmm.
and stayed in New York for a month, which is when she met my dad. And they decided they wanted to get married. And so she decided to move here permanently. And that's how me, my sister, my parents, and my dad's parents ended up as a small family unit in New York. And then the rest of our
Yeah.
extended family is still in Japan.
That's amazing. So like for you growing up, I guess you were probably obviously having like a similar experience, I would think, right? In terms of, having that Japanese household, but already that Japanese household that was very open-minded and had experienced a lot of different things. So there was already a lot of kind of that curiosity around, the different experiences and how they make us, kind of who we are, right? But for you, right, growing up in New York City, seeing this, how was that different from your father, or similar? Like, I'm curious.
Yeah, I think so. I've actually never talked to my dad very much about this,
Yeah.
but I think like between the two of them, we had a pretty like balanced life, I would say. Like my dad obviously had the foundation of life in New York and he understood how things worked here. But it was really my mom who made sure that we grew up as a Japanese family. So we only spoke Japanese at home, like even
Hmm.
between me and my sister. She cooked us Japanese food. She read us Japanese books. Um, my cousins would send us like VHS tapes from Japan of like cartoons, which
Hmm.
was so my knowledge of Japanese, cartoons when I was little was like limited to these VHS tapes,
Yeah.
because that's what we did back then. And then we'd also go back during the summers to visit my grandmother on my mom's side. So, and I think that was also really formative.
Hmm.
Like, I think it was something we really looked forward to every year. And I think even since we were little, like, it really felt like visiting a different world, like it was like different language wise, obviously, but then like the food, the way people interacted, and different toys. And so I
Right.
think that was something that was really special. Like every summer we would experience that. So, like you said, you know, I did grow up in New York, but I was also raised in a very Japanese household. So it was a really interesting combination, I would say.
Yeah. And would you say that, I guess at that early age, I'm curious, how did you identify yourself, right? Like, did you see yourself as, I'm American, I'm Japanese, I'm a mix, kind of like that, those early initial kind of like takes on kind of what your identity was.
Yeah, so that's something I really struggled with, and I think it was, we really did grow up with the best of both worlds. And now looking back, I wouldn't have it any other way. And I really appreciate my parents for really, you know, presenting us the two sides. But, I think when you're a kid and you're still figuring out the world and you're figuring out who you are and how people build relationships, it was really hard for me, I think, to really balance the two sides.
Hmm.
I think some kids are a little bit better at sort of merging their two identities and, um, yeah, just sort of merging them both. But for me, it's always been really separate in my mind. I think
Hmm.
because culturally they're so different. Um, so I really struggled with my dual identity, and it really felt like I was living split lives. Like I think that's how I would define my childhood. Like it really
Yeah.
felt like I was, operating on a switch almost. Like I
Hmm.
would have my American switch for outside the house, and then I would have my Japanese switch for when I'm with my family, for example.
Yeah.
Um, so there was definitely like a inside the house and outside the house difference.
Hmm.
And also for context, where we lived was the Upper East Side in Manhattan, which is not the most diverse
Right.
neighborhood.
Yeah.
um, which I love. Like I still live here actually because I love
Hmm.
it for other reasons.
Yeah.
It's low key, it's residential, and it's where I feel most comfortable. But it's predominantly white. And back then, there weren't very many Japanese people or people of color, really, or even businesses, or, we didn't have Japanese restaurants around us like we do now.
Right.
So it was very uh, different. When we stepped outside the house, we had to act differently, speak differently. And then I also attended two different schools, which was when you're at that age, your school is everything. So I went to a regular American school Monday through Friday, like you do. And this was also on the Upper East Side. So it was, it wasn't not diverse. I think at that time they really pushed for diversity and inclusivity. So I never felt excluded or, there was never any bullying, but it was still, mostly white. Maybe there was one other East Asian kid in my class and a couple kids of color, but um, it was predominantly a very white school. And that's where I went from kindergarten through high school. So my entire 13 years of education. So that was my regular school, Monday through Friday. But then I also went to a Japanese weekend school on Saturdays. And I also went there for 13 years.
Hmm.
And this wasn't just like a language immersion program. This was like 4 to 6 hours every Saturday of all the subjects. So like
Oh,
literature, math, history,
right.
science in Japanese. And you're actually using textbooks that kids in Japan would use. So it was like a different version of school.
That's fascinating getting like those two types of education, right? Like, because it is an immersion, right? Like, it is in a way. I didn't actually realize that there were these kind of schools, right? That actually just kind of get you to really experience a culture, right? Like in kind of like that deep way.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
actually all around the country. And I think they're around internationally too, but it was actually really interesting. The time that I went there, so this was the 90s to the early 2000s, was actually a time when there was a lot of Japanese companies sending employees over to the US for corporate business exchange. And so these
I see.
employees would also bring their families. And so the kids who went to my Japanese school were usually kids from Japan, and they would
Right.
be here for a couple of years before they go back. So they weren't here to assimilate necessarily. They were here to maintain their Japanese education for when they went back. So I think even in that school, I felt really different because it was clear that these kids were, here temporarily and going back, whereas
Mhm.
I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon.
Right.
Um, and that I was more American and was expected to be that way. So yeah, it was a really interesting dynamic. And again, like having two very different environments, two very different friend circles, different teachers. And for whatever reason, they never really overlapped in my
Interesting.
mind. Yeah.
But probably now, and we'll get to talk about sibling and I think everything, all the great things that you're doing. But I would imagine that now it's a little bit of bringing those worlds together, right? From what I understand, like would that be kind of like a fair assessment?
Yeah. I mean, now
Yeah.
it's really crazy to think, why they were so separate. Because, like you said, now I'm all about bringing everything together. But yeah, I think as early as I can remember, I was really confused and conflicted all the
Hmm.
time of like what is the right way to behave in this moment and kind of feeling out what is expected of me because
Right.
I was constantly feeling not American enough in my
Hmm.
American context and then not feeling Japanese enough in the Japanese context. And so I began really fixating on differences
Hmm.
and, like what is different? Why am I different? And I think that really started to build a lot of insecurity around my differences. Like, even when I had friends coming over to my house, I was really aware that my house was different than their house. Like, just the objects around the house, the stuff that my mom cooks, even the language that I'm speaking with her that they might not understand. So I think that was, an insecurity. And then also just again, going to the school on Saturdays, meant that I would be doing homework Friday nights because I most likely wouldn't have done the homework until then.
Hmm.
So my American friends are going out for the weekend and I'm stuck doing homework and having to wake up really early the next day. Um, or even, like for social, like holidays, for example, New Year's is really big in Japanese culture,
Yeah.
except New Year's happens on the first of the new year,
Right.
whereas in the US, it's, you celebrate the eve. So,
Hmm.
my friends would want to go out on New Year's Eve, party, get drunk, you're out late, and then the next morning, you're trashed. Whereas my family, my mother would want us to gather for New Year's Eve brunch, and we have to arrive
Right.
really, like well presented because we're taking a
Right.
family photo and it's
Not
very
hangover.
formal. Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
again, like you have to wrestle with like, well, do I want to be responsible and like do the right thing and stay in, or do I want to go out? So I think there was a lot of conflict like that growing up. Um, so I think definitely very much an early identity crisis, and that really led to extreme, I think, social anxiety too. Like I really didn't know what it meant to be myself because it literally felt like there were two different versions of myself, and wearing two different hats and playing two different sides, and um, not really seeing myself fit in here nor there. And I think it was really difficult to relate to people. And I
Yeah.
didn't really have anyone to talk to about that either.
Yeah. And
Which,
it's interesting, like if I'm trying, obviously I'm trying to think like, in my perspective, for example, or like in my experience, I grew up and I was born and raised in Colombia. So I moved to the US when I was 17. So I was actually, as you were talking about that duality and kind of like that idea of finding your identity, like my experience was a little bit in terms of I moved here being identifying myself as Colombian, right? Like everybody would ask me, "Hey, where are you from?" I'm from Colombia, right? But it's interesting that the more time that I spent here, the more I started, I guess, Americanizing myself in a way, and and my relationship to being Colombian started to change as well, where I was no longer like I would come back to see family like every like maybe once a year type of situation, but I started going less and less. And when I would go there, like I stopped, talking to a lot of friends, like my relationship to the country and to my identity as Colombian kind of changed. Like it was no longer about the place so much, but about the family. So it was interesting. I think like the how the lines started to blur a little bit in kind of defining when someone asks you like who you are, right? Like I used to say I'm Colombian, but now it's no, I mean, I was born in Colombia, but I've been in New York for so long that probably more of a New Yorker now, and trying to guess, grapple or like try to kind of figure out like that relationship, between these two identities that different, I think, to your perspective, to your experience. But it's interesting, like how do you, being in that position to having to kind of to have two cultures that define you and try to kind of figure out, trying to navigate what do I take from this one versus what do I take from this one? What can I leave behind? It's a hard thing to do, right? To kind of to truly
mm,
get to that point to say, no, I'm a mix of all of them in a way. And I take the things that are, I guess work for me as who, where I am right now. So I think it's just interesting. I think like that tension, between the two cultures and how to work, how to work through that. Uh, and I'm curious, I think
yeah.
in your experience, was there a moment, I think, when you started to you find a way, I guess, to work, with the two identities and to kind of almost move past that split divide that you were discussing?
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's actually really interesting about you talking about like what you leave behind versus not, because yeah, that must be a little bit different from me, and but we can get to that.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but yes, no, there was definitely a defining moment in my mind where I actually did like a 180. Um, and again, like up until this point, this is all me just um, like post analyzing, I guess, like my situation. But in that moment, like when you're a kid and you're going through these things, you're not really thinking about, what is causing all these
right.
confusions. So I never really talked to anyone about it again, in either of my schools, there weren't really people that seemed to be going through similar things. I guess also with my parents, like Japanese culture, you don't really talk about emotions very much. So I didn't
Hmm.
really, it was never something I openly talked about really, um, except for one teacher. And it was really just one conversation that completely changed how I thought about this.
Yeah.
And I think she must have picked up on the fact that, I was having trouble opening up. I was very closed up. I wasn't very confident in myself. And I think I had written like a paper that touched on like a personal experience that compared something that was going on in my Japanese school and how I related to that. And she read this and she basically pulled me aside and gave it to me really straight.
Hmm.
And she told me, she was like, look, you will never be fully American and you will never be fully Japanese,
Wow. Yeah.
but you are both. And that means that your world is twice as big and you see twice as much and you understand twice as much. And that's something that not many people can have, which seems so obvious now, again,
It-
given what we
yeah.
do. Um, but that was the first time I really heard it being spun in, I guess, a positive way. And, like I realized that not being here, not being there, like something that I had thought was a setback or weakness this entire time could actually be a uniqueness or even a strength that other
Hmm.
people would find interesting. And I think the most important part that she touched on, like when she told me that, was the part where she says, like, you will never fully be Japanese or American.
Right.
As in, like, it's not possible. Like, that is not a realistic expectation. And I think that really let me just free myself of all these unrealistic expectations that I had of trying to be one or the other. So I think in a way, in a really healthy way, I think I just gave up. Like,
Hmm.
I just completely gave up, like, trying
Right.
to be something I was not. And, after that, it was really like, well, I am what I am. There's nothing I can do about it. This is how it's going to be. So I need to make the most of it. And I think that was the first step towards just self acceptance.
Hmm.
And I say first step because it took a lot longer than that
Yeah.
to, eventually completely accept myself. Yeah, I think that was when I really just went, you know what, like I'm going to listen to me. I'm going to
Hmm.
wear what I want. I'm going to listen to music that I like. I want to go to art school. So it was, in a way, it was really devastating, but it was also really freeing. And I
Yeah.
remember that really, really, yeah, vividly.
I mean, that's such a profound moment. No, like it truly is, right? Because you're right. Like it sounds, yes, of course that's true. But even like when you were saying it, like give me a little bit of chills because it's like, yeah, like, like it is really kind of switching the perception or like a complete 180 in terms of what, like you were saying, what you see as, a negative is actually a strength, is actually a positive. I think like that already opens it up, for you to be like, there's so much I can do because I have these two worlds, and I have these two sets of experiences and all of this, right? So, I mean, it's fascinating. I think like
Yeah,
that's such a great moment to have.
yeah. And I don't know
Yeah.
whether, like, at that point, I probably didn't think anything about making anything of
Yeah.
it. It was just
Right.
more like, what am I so hung up on if, there was no point in it? So it was really just like giving up, like dropping it all and being like, I'm not going to fixate on that anymore. I'm going to fixate on other things that I care about. Um, and yeah, that just kind of really propelled me into what I want to do.
That's great. And, and
Yeah.
and and would you say that was it around this moment where you found, I guess, your creativity and where you kind of went on the creative journey of deciding I want to do something in the arts and design and maybe not even design, like maybe just even I want to be creative. I'm a creative person. I want to go that path. Is that around this time or was that before?
Yeah. So I brought up art school because that was probably one of the first things that I decided for myself.
Hmm.
really, versus following someone else's expectation.
Yeah.
Um, because I did love art, for as long as I can remember. Like, I think a lot of kids love art, but that was one of my favorite subjects. And, again, also post rationalizing, but it was probably really helpful that, visual expression is universal. Like, you don't need any language or words, or there's no cultural barriers. So I think as an introverted kid, it probably really helped me overcome a lot of my social anxiety. Like, I was really freely able to express myself, and I was also good at it. And I knew that, it was something I really enjoyed. Um, and it also probably allowed me to really kind of explore the gray zone. Like, there's no right or wrong answers. Again, like, I was so caught up in, what's right, what's wrong, um, you know, black and white, that I think art probably let me just sort of let go of that. So it was definitely a good way to explore myself. So when it came to university, I always knew that I wanted to continue art in some shape or form.
Hmm.
But having Japanese parents, art is a very taboo subject when it comes to
Yes.
career choice, which I guess any parent, wouldn't want their kid to be a starving artist. But, around the time where I had that revelation of I'm just going to do me. But this is my Japanese side where I'm still very respectful of my parents. So I
Hmm.
told them that I would like to apply to one art school just to see if I can get in, because that's what I cared about. And they said, fine, you can apply, but make sure you apply to regular schools too, um, because, we want you to become a doctor or,
Right.
a lawyer one day. So I ended up applying to 12 liberal arts schools and one art school, which
Hmm.
was RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design.
Yeah.
And I applied. And when it came to, when all the decisions came out and I was assessing my options, I only cared about the art school. Like, the other ones, I really didn't care whether I got in or not. And I couldn't really see
Right.
myself. It didn't really matter where I went.
Hmm.
Versus RISD, I really wanted to be there. And I told my dad that, or my parents, and my mom cried, which was extremely traumatic
Yeah.
for
Can
me.
imagine.
And it was probably really hard for her because, again, it's a world that she doesn't know. And also just all the stigma around art schools, I think, in especially Asian cultures, it was really scary to them. But my dad finally told me that, you can go as long as you're able to find a job after, be
Right.
responsible.
Hmm.
Um, but he was like, I trust that you will be able to, you know, do something with it. So he's really the one that let me go. And so I went, and I think that, when you go to art school, you have the choice of going into the fine arts or design, usually. And I think it was probably, the part of me that was like, okay, I need to be responsible with my choices. But I think I was immediately drawn to design just because, of course, there's the potential for job prospects after, but I think it also really had to do with making my art useful in a
Right.
way. And that's something that was really ingrained in me, I think, through my mom and through Japanese cultural values, because, Japan is a very collectivist culture. So you're always thinking about being useful to others. So she would always say,
Interesting. Yeah.
like, make sure, how are you being useful in this moment, or make sure you're being useful, or put yourself to good use. And so I think
Hmm.
that's always been a big part of, how I think and how I operate. And so to me, how to make art useful was design, because, design can be applied in so many different ways. And I also think that it really came naturally to me because, design is all about looking at things from different perspectives. And I think that's where I really found that, having had this dual perspective made me more creative and made me, more open to ideas, and also having more empathy, right? Which is so core to design thinking and user experiences. So it just really felt right. Um, and again, this is all me post rationalizing now.
Right.
But I should add that, once I sort of had that revelation, when I was 17, realizing, um, there's nothing I can do with my identity. I actually didn't think about my identity at all. Like throughout university, into my early adult life, like for the next 10 years, like I didn't think about it. And it was probably almost like a reaction to like not wanting to waste another minute on something that I had struggled with for so long, like throughout my whole childhood, that I think I even like distanced myself fairly consciously and avoided situations, for example, like, there was an Asian American student community at school. And I think I consciously avoided that, thinking, that's not who I am and that doesn't define me.
Right.
Or like Japanese American groups. And even though I recognize that the importance of the community, I think I didn't want that to define me in a way, which is really funny to think about given how it's such a big part of what I do now and who I am. But it's really something I've only come full circle to and I guess embraced in the last couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to think that in a way you have to go inward, like, right? You have to kind of truly almost think about you as the individual and reflect on who you truly are to truly be able to define who you are, to then be able to use design as a way to empathize and to communicate a product, a service, right? Like, and kind of connect. So in a way, it's like the more inward we get, the more universal we become in a way.
Yeah, and I think also, I think there's a lot more awareness now of identity, and I think people openly talk about it. But again, like this is why I think like these kinds of conversations are so important because I didn't really hear much of those types of discussions, and maybe it was the environment that I grew up in. Again, there weren't very many immigrants around me. I actually didn't even consider myself an Asian American until I got to college because college is the first time you meet people from all around the country and all
Right.
around the world. And I think that was the first time I realized that people see me as Asian, just
Hmm.
like very generally Asian with a capital A,
Right.
um, versus having grown up with, 13 years going to the same school with the same people. It's like they know who I am. Um, so that was also eye-opening, like how people see you and define you in different contexts, which I'm sure you also experienced when you came to the US.
100%. So I grew up in Colombia, but I actually went to a German school. My whole
Oh,
education, I have no German background. I guess in everywhere in the world, but especially in Latin America, there is a German school, a French school, a British school. So you have the opportunity to go to one of those. So it was really interesting growing up as a Colombian, learning German, learning about German culture, eventually actually spending some time in Germany when I did a little exchange program. And then my mom moved to the US before I did. So I would come also every summer. So I would just walk the city and like I would go to museums and like that's a little bit of a kind of like a journey to explore and kind of find myself in a way. But to your point, like, yes, like the moment that you actually start interacting with people from all over the world, you start seeing the similarities. You start seeing that everybody's actually going through a similar experience on trying to define themselves and trying to kind of
mm-hmm.
find that balance between who they are, where they're from, and kind of where they are now, and who they are as a person, which might be different from any of those two, right? So it's just very interesting. I think like, yeah, like that influx of different experiences that help you. It gives you a little bit of community. They give you a sense of, oh, I'm not in this alone, right? Like other people are going through something
Mm-hmm.
similar, which helps you, I think, in continuing that path.
Yeah, definitely. I think in your case too, you have like so many different points of reference, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think like having multiple points of reference too kind of helps you understand like the different sides of yourself because you have something to
Mm-hmm.
compare it to. So yeah, that was definitely comforting to see and just sort of talk to people. And then even just like understanding how, again, like Asian Americans are such a broad group of people and it's all different kinds of ethnicities just sort of grouped into one in the US. But even the differences between Japanese Americans on the East Coast versus the West Coast, because on the West Coast they have a longer history and they have, history with internment camps and lots of, like more
Hmm.
long-term struggle versus on the East Coast, it tends to be newer immigrants coming in. So yeah, it's just fascinating to understand like the spectrum of who we are and where you fit in. And so, yeah, I think my appreciation definitely, was it was a newfound appreciation
Yeah.
during my university years.
I'm curious, at what point you decided to start Sibling? I think in terms of your journey, right? Like you work on a couple of agencies, like you mentioned, then went to Google. And then after that, I think you mentioned that you had freelance in Japan or you had gone to Japan. Was that the kind of like the spark or like the moment where you said, oh, actually, maybe I want to start my own thing, or I'm curious kind of what was that spark, like that moment of where Sibling, the idea of Sibling came to life?
Yeah. So it was actually a pretty gradual process. Although it was a chance encounter that really started everything. But just to give a little bit of context, so again, didn't think anything about my identity. I focused solely on design and branding. I majored in graphic design in university, so I started immediately at a branding agency when I graduated. So I joined one of the big branding agencies, one called Landor, and that was a really amazing, I think, foundational place to start because, you're not just working in design in a silo, but you're, working alongside strategists and verbal designers, researchers, and you're really understanding how design sort of fits into the bigger picture of a business. So there was a lot of, you know, um, yeah, good learnings, lots of very big, like Fortune 500 companies, like corporate branding,
Yeah.
complex architecture. So it was a good learning experience. And I was there for 5 years. And then around that time, D2C branding was sort of booming. And I was really curious to kind of understand like what the buzz was about.
Hmm.
So that's when I switched to Red Antler. And Red Antler is known to sort of create the new D2C
Right.
branding formula.
Yeah.
And so that was a completely different experience
Hmm.
of realizing just the different needs of a startup versus, a corporate company.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just like a completely different scale, it's a different speed. They just need something to go to market, something that's eye-catching um, and also it's just a lot more emotional, which I found
Hmm.
really interesting. When you work with a startup, you're either working directly with the founders or people who are personally invested in it. So there's a lot of emotions and a lot of passion around it versus
Yeah.
I think in corporate branding, it's usually the marketing team or people who are a little bit more removed from the brand itself. Um, and so that was a really interesting experience. So I'd kind of, started working in that more startup space. And that's how I sort of ended up at Google. I worked for one of their bets to sort of manage their creative and brand. But it was around there that I actually got a message from someone I crossed paths with at RISD.
Hmm.
And this was a guy from Japan. And we had overlap for only a year where I think he was sent by his company to study design in the US and then bring it back. But I even remember being slightly annoyed at the time
Yeah.
of being introduced to him because, again, it was probably someone who said, you're Japanese, he's Japanese, you'll get
You should
along,
meet, right? Yeah.
you should meet. And I was like, I hated it when that happened,
Right.
but I guess he remembered me, and I guess he saw, what I was up to on LinkedIn. So we reconnected, and it turns out that he was running a startup in Tokyo, and it was a digital service. So, he wanted to market the service to the US, but his whole team of 5 people were all in Tokyo and they were all Japanese. And so he basically said, we want to market to the US, but I need someone to teach me about branding in the US and someone who can help me with marketing and, advise us on how to localize the product and brand. And so would you be willing to come to Tokyo for 3 months and work with us as we develop this product. And when he said that to me, all I thought at that point in time was, 3 months in Tokyo is a great excuse to go over,
Totally. Yeah.
sounds fun.
Yeah.
And at that point, I hadn't really been going back, I think, throughout my high school and college years very much. So it was, in a way, my first time as an adult. And it just seemed like a bucket list item. And I thought, that's great. Like, I'll work a few days a week and I'll do a lot of traveling in between. So I said yes. But when I got there, that's where it all really clicked.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what I thought I was going over there for was brand consulting, but it was actually brand plus cross-cultural consulting. So analyzing
Right.
cultural differences in design.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the first time I realized, like, this is where I could be the most useful.
Right.
And, also just being able to use my background in, being in branding agencies and also going through a design education in the US.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I can teach and share with you everything I know. Like, I can share best practices and watch outs,
Right.
like that I knew I could do. And I also had the language skills to communicate that to them in words that they understand, which was also very big. Although I will say that at that point I had zero Japanese business skills. So I was probably talking
Right.
to them like I would to my family or my mom. I'm a lot better now, but,
Yeah.
they were also a startup. They wanted to go global. So they really understood that, they were going to meet me in the middle. So, very kind about that. But I think the most important thing was that I understood enough about cultural differences that I was able to identify gaps in understanding, or like why certain ideas weren't translating. And that usually comes down to things like, differences in behaviors and customs and societal values and even education, which are all things that I had wrestled with growing up. So it was kind of this moment where I realized it was my unique combination of life experience, education, and then career that really made me, the right fit to do this job. And so
Yeah.
it was a big light bulb moment. And I'm not saying that I immediately had any answers. Like, these things don't become immediately obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it really takes a lot of conversations and like digging into things like, everything from like the user experience of a product to the layout to, like messaging and word choices or like even color
Mm-hmm.
combinations. And then like figuring out like why that feels off. Because I think, like anyone who looks at like a foreign product can tell that it's not made for them when it's not like the right
Right.
colors or the right
Mm-hmm.
layout. But it's not enough to say, this is wrong and you have to change this. Like, you really need to explain it from the place of like, why does it need to be different? Like, why are these differences happening? Like, for example, Japanese websites are a great and notorious example of like being super dense with
Right.
information.
Uh-huh.
And it really comes down to, that's what Japanese websites are like. They're usually really dense. They have a lot of content. And it comes down to people feeling security in having that information. Like, that's what people look for. And that's what people think is trustworthy in a company versus an American website that tends to be really light in content. When there's like a lot of missing content, to them, that doesn't seem very reliable, or, it doesn't feel like a website. But,
Yeah.
you have to explain that in the US, like, people look for information a lot more quickly. Like, we need
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy to give us the
Need
information
like
that
the
we need.
most important thing, right? Like, yeah.
Exactly. And then like you can even trace that back to like differences in education, right? Like in Japan, the whole country is educated on a singular education system. So everyone can read, and people are
Right.
used to reading the same amount of text and they can understand it, versus the US is a really diverse country where people might not everyone speaks English as their first language. So you can't
Mm-hmm.
have tons of English text because not everyone's going to understand it. And so therefore we communicate in a way that's more direct and a little bit easier to understand. So, you can go down a rabbit hole, but like these are the kinds of conversations I really loved and enjoyed.
Yeah, like one of the things that in my mind I'm thinking about is, okay, we both come from branding, right? So like the idea that when you create a brand, you need to create consistency. It doesn't mean that everything needs to be the same, right? Like you do need to, you'll have different audiences and you have, you can kind of like, the brand should flex to scenarios and to audiences, but it should feel like a cohesive, you know, it should be a cohesive brand. It should be a cohesive product, a cohesive experience, right? So that's probably an interesting, I think, tension that I could see happening, where you have a brand that needs to live in both of these spaces and it still feel like the brand, right? Like, but it
Hmm.
needs to speak to the right audience, right? Like, and kind of be relevant for that audience, right?
Yeah, no, you're so right. It's always a tricky balance. And I think that's why it's localizing. It's rarely recreating the brand completely. That
Hmm.
happens too, sometimes, but yeah, it's usually a balance of figuring out like what is actually core to your brand, what makes your brand DNA, like what it is. So what do we keep versus what needs to be adjusted and in what
Right.
situations. And I think when that happens, and this is the reason why I say like you can't just tell them, put less words on your website. You have
Right.
to really get the other side to understand like, well, you know, why it needs to happen, why your current way of doing things won't work. And if we need to distill the message, it's like, what is the core thing that we want to communicate? So it's a lot of conversation and a lot of understanding in order to get to a place where they feel comfortable changing or adjusting their brand. But then also for people over here to feel like, oh, this has been made for me, or this is something that I understand and I can accept. So yeah, no, it's a fascinating balance, and there's never like a right way of doing things, but there's
Right.
best practices, but never like a
Right.
cookie cutter way to approach.
And I'm sure it continues to evolve. So I'm curious. When you finished that, freelance project in Tokyo, you came back and did Sibling happen then, or how was that experience from, you went to Tokyo, you work on this project? How did Sibling, I guess, come about after that?
Yeah, so it happened really organically. Like I never thought, I wanted to start my own agency or I was going to become a founder. Like that wasn't really me, but it was really organic growth. So at first it was all word of mouth. Other companies like through this startup wanted similar advice on their branding. It was also starting to expand into a lot of research because, people can do like desktop research in Japan, but they're not going to get the same amount of, on the ground insights that you would here. So there was a lot of, you know, projects coming in word of mouth, at which point I was freelancing. But then I really started seeing that this was an unmet need because there's a couple things that Japanese companies struggled with when they first come over or are thinking about coming over. The first is lack of resources on the ground. And that's because, distance wise, it's really
Hmm.
far away. So it's really hard for them to send people over here or manage a team on the other side of the world. So there's not usually many people who can sort of go back and forth. And so, not enough people. And then language barrier is also a really big one because, compared to a lot of other countries, Japan tends to fall behind when it comes to, English abilities and especially in the business context. And then also culturally, it's polar opposites when it comes to behaviors and values. And again, when you do business, like business is done really differently. Like decisions are made a lot more carefully and slowly. The way businesses move projects along are differently, like initial amounts of investment are really different. So again, like, it's really difficult for them to localize or launch a brand in the US when they don't have enough resources or information. They don't have the communication abilities. And they also just don't know where to go. So there's no support system for them. And I think doing this work, I started feeling really like personally invested where like it was such a waste, right? Because I know that Japan has great products, they have great ideas, but like all of these things, if only there was someone who can help them out, like shouldn't be an issue. And I think also as a Japanese American, like for them to do well, for to see more Japanese companies doing well in the US, like I want to see that. Like I didn't see that when I
Right.
was
Yeah.
growing up. I mean, now there's like Uniqlo and Muji and, there's
Hmm.
matcha lattes everywhere,
Right.
which like we're actually doing a very informal study on the amount of matcha lattes in New York City right now. And we've been keeping track of coffee shops that offer matcha lattes and don't. We've
Right.
only been able to find one coffee shop that doesn't sell matcha lattes. And we've been to a lot of coffee shops.
That's yeah, that's what I would imagine. Yeah, it's such a big part now of I guess the culture here, right? That everybody has one, right?
Yeah, and like childhood me would have never imagined. And like I even have like the, typical immigrant kid experience of, my mom packed me like a Japanese lunch one day at
Hmm.
school and it was an onigiri, like a rice ball. And back then, like people didn't really know what seaweed was. So I had this like black strip of seaweed around a
Right.
ball of rice and some kid probably told me, like, ew, what's that? And that scarred me for life. And I never wanted to eat an onigiri again. And now they're selling for $8 in Brooklyn. But it's like all those things
Yeah.
really make me happy because it's finally being appreciated. That's how like innovation happens and that's how like cultures move forward. And so I really want to be a part of that change, like be a
Yeah.
part of that scene that I didn't have growing up. And so I felt, I think, a personal responsibility and also passion to that's something I could do. Like that's something I could be useful in. So that's when I decided to just completely quit my job at Google
Hmm.
and just give myself a year to see what I can do with it. And we are now in year 3 and it's been a lot of work. It's been really interesting to see, yeah, all the different brands, all the different companies are thinking of coming over. Yeah, so that's super exciting.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and what does I'm curious, what does the name Sibling mean to you, or what did you come up with the name for the agency?
Yes, thank you. No, that's a
Yeah.
very important part. So
Yeah.
Sibling was a very intentional name because we wanted Japanese companies to realize that we are your siblings overseas.
Right.
So it's a more personal and approachable way than saying, we're cross-cultural consultants. So we
Right.
wanted to be someone who feels familiar and close to home. And, we understand where you come from because even though we're on opposite sides of the world, you know, we are a part of you and we really, we're personally invested and want to help you out. So you can, reach out to us and count on us. And this is also a response to another like personal um, passion that I have, which is the importance of Japanese Americans
Hmm.
to Japanese companies, because it's actually a really missed opportunity where a lot of Japanese companies don't really recognize Japanese Americans as a resource. Like they tend to see us as Americans and that we're different. And so we're
Right.
kind of dismissed or not really, yeah, we're just not really recognized. But my thought is, and you don't have to be Japanese American, like ethnically, you can also be a person who had maybe gone to Japan and came back or have worked there and like share a similar interest. But when you have a shared experience or understanding, it's like we're a lot more passionate and we're personally invested in helping these companies. And so, the argument is rather than going to any other agency, like we actually want you to succeed. So that's the feeling that we have around Sibling. And so I call all of my team members and collaborators and also clients siblings because, we're all part of the same community. And I would consider you, Alejo, as a sibling after this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Um, yeah, because we have a shared passion for cultural
Yeah.
exchange and
Hmm.
also recognizing that someone's success is a shared success for the future of US Japan relations and also just cultural enrichment overall. And, you know, once you're able to extend that kind of invitation, I think, people can sort of take that opportunity to realize that there's someone on the other side and that's sometimes just the nudge that they need to get something started.
Yeah. It's so great because I think from, like, for example, from these conversations, but also from even the website, and I think the type of work that you're doing, I think this is very apparent. That there is this more personal connection, and there is kind of like this passion for making these connections and kind of bridging, these two cultures or these two companies, or kind of helping companies, like just kind of blur a little bit of the divisions, which I think is just a fascinating thing, and you're right. It's something that I'm passionate about. Is the reason that, that I'm kind of embarking on this journey of this podcast, is to kind of blur some of these divisions and to kind of find the commonalities and to find how we can better understand each other, how we can better work with each other, regardless of kind of where we're from, regardless of the differences, right? Like that tend to divide us, and especially nowadays, which I think it's more and more prevalent. So really ensuring,
Yes.
that it's great. I think like that using you're doing obviously a very similar thing, but I think through the lens of helping businesses, which then have an effect on society. So I think it's just really fascinating. So all of it to say that it does come through, I think, in everything that you do, and the work that Sibling does. So it's great to see.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
great to hear. No, thanks for saying that. And I think also like once you start this sort of work, which I'm sure you also find, is that you start to find people with similar interests and similar passions. And I think that's been the best part, to realize that, I started Sibling by myself,
yeah,
with the name. But now it's like I've met so many people who also want to do something similar and, help each other out. Um, and so I actually have a good team of collaborators who I work with, and, we each play to our strengths. And um, so it really is a group effort. Like, I don't believe anymore in doing anything on your own. So I think that community building aspect too, which happens, very organically, is definitely an important part.
yeah.
So I
No
think what
one.
you're doing is really important too.
No, thank you. I'm curious. Just a couple more questions. You know, before we wrap up. Do you ever see a world where you do the opposite, where you help American brands enter the Japanese market? Is that something that either you're doing or planning to do, or you want to focus on kind of like that one way from Japan to the US?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely a future plan. So
Yeah.
right now, personally, I've never worked in Japan, so I
Hmm.
don't have enough of an understanding of the Japan market or Japanese users. But I have helped foreign companies communicate with teams in Japan. I've also
Hmm.
helped American agencies actually work better with Japanese clients. So there is definitely a world in which, Sibling can become the in-between of these collaborative spaces and helping, both sides better communicate and better find a common ground. So that's been interesting. But we are slowly building a network of, designers, copywriters in Japan. So once we get enough people, that might become a reality. And also my actual sibling, my sister, currently lives in Tokyo. Again, a Japanese American who,
Yeah.
she was actually less interested in Japan growing up compared to me, but has now found a way to live there, and, she's having a great time. So yeah, you never know.
You never know. That's true. One of the things I think that you mentioned in some of our previous conversations is that you're starting to experiment with events and trend reports. I'm curious, is that some of the ways that you're thinking about what's next for Sibling? In addition to the projects, the client work.
Yeah, yeah. So I think client work is definitely our main focus, but we also want to find ways to, again, create opportunities for connection and also provide more resources for people, to not just businesses, but I think just people in Japan, but also people in the US, to just sort of find more connection points to just appreciate the cross cultural space. So, yes, we do a lot of trend reports now, which is currently mostly in Japanese. It's to bring, the latest trends or what's going on, actual like in-person interviews in the US, and putting that into a report and making it available online so that people can get the latest on, yeah, where are the opportunities, what's going on. So if any American companies want to be featured or, promote to Japan, that's definitely a great channel that we're working on. And then events wise, this is an area that we're really experimenting with. We have a couple creative community events in New York where we really try to bring together potential collaborators, but also people who are interested in, this cross-cultural space and businesses who might want to reach a new audience. So we tend to feature like a Japanese business or a Japanese brand, and then just create this more of a networking opportunity for people to meet other cool people, but also experience this or meet new brands. And so that's sort of an ongoing thing. But we're also doing neighborhood tours with Fast Company in September as part of their innovation festival. And we're taking people around the Greenpoint neighborhood in Brooklyn, where there's a lot of emerging Japanese businesses, and just letting people know that there's a new wave of Japanese businesses emerging in New York, and it's driving all these new food trends. And so that should be really interesting. So we're experimenting in a lot of different ways, but all that to say, we're also always looking for fellow siblings, people who want to be a part of this conversation, whether it's, being part of an event or helping out with a project. I think the biggest joy is just connecting with people with similar passions and interests. So if you want to get involved, do let me know, because we're always doing up new ideas.
100%. Yeah, we'll add the like ways to contact you in once you publish the episode. So yes, anybody that wants to collaborate, they'll have a way to reach out to Mari. And so the last question is, I'm curious, based on your experience, what advice would you give someone that has an idea, that whether that's studying their own thing, studying a project, company, what advice would you give them for them to kind of take that leap, and to actually start?
I think one that I still follow and have always followed is find a way to be useful. I think if you're useful to someone, you get to connect with them, and that leads to other things. And I think that also helps you find value in yourself, purpose in what you do. And, that really opens up doors. So whatever thing, however small, there's always a way for you to add something of value. And so I think once you start identifying those opportunities and just sort of, keep following what you're doing, I think it could lead to bigger changes in a really organic way.
That's such great advice and great way to end this conversation. Mari, thank you so much for sharing your story so openly. I really appreciate, learning about your background, your history, and kind of how you're really taking charge, I think, of your past and your history to create something, and to your point, serve people, and to kind of have an impact, I think, in people's lives. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing this with us, and I've really enjoyed, this conversation with you.
Yeah, likewise. This was fun and also very therapeutic. So thank you for the opportunity. I highly
Awesome.
recommend it.
Perfect. Thank you, Mari. And yeah, so to everyone listening, again, thank you for being here. We'll add some more information on how to reach out to Mari, but you can visit sibling.info, right? That's the website, to learn more about Mari's agency and the work. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it with a friend, leave a review, and because we really want a lot of people to be able to get value out of the work that we're doing here. And thank you so much. So see you next time on First Person.